The subject here, the health workforce of the 21st century, clearly is a taxing one for all of us. And what I wanted to do today, if I can, is address it in this way by first talking about this null hypothesis of sustainability and fitness for purpose, to talk about the global demand-supply affordability mismatch, which is the milieu in which we think about the health workforce of the 21st century, and a health workforce for New Zealand for 2020. The null hypothesis of is our health system sustainable and fit for purpose can be easily misunderstood because, in fact, many people assume that because I argue it's neither sustainable nor fit for purpose, that, in fact, it's currently in breach. I think it's important to preface anything I say by this overall comment, that overall I think most New Zealanders who need healthcare get the healthcare they need when they need it and to a very high standard. The question is how we are going about delivering that high-quality healthcare, and to a large extent, I suspect it reflects both the goodwill and the competence of the health workforce. The issue for me, though, is the current configurations, are the current models of care, are the current ways we go about business sustainable, and are they fit for future purpose, which is a very different series of questions. So the fact that I argue that our health system is neither sustainable nor fit for future purpose should not be interpreted as a criticism of extant service delivery, because it isn't. So let's talk about this global demand-supply affordability mismatch. And the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what do New Zealanders expect in regard to health services? Because this is the beginning of any of our conversations. In an ideal world, we would, in such a small and relatively poor country, be able to negotiate just what we can afford. What can this country sensibly afford in terms of allocation to healthcare, and what's the best value for that commitment? But in fact, I don't think that conversation is accessible to us. To a very large extent, our sense of healthcare is embedded so deeply in our sense of citizenship that it's not vulnerable to that sort of debate. I was on the welfare working group, and it was an interesting experience for me in that I'd never realised before the extent to which a lot of people believe genuinely that the central social contract in this country is social welfare. And I thought, how can that possibly be true? How can any society be based on welfare? Unless you have some external philanthropist of extraordinary means, how can any state be based on welfare? Surely the central social contract is that those of us who can work do work, and through that work we contribute directly and indirectly through our taxation to our society. And the reason why we have social welfare is to support those that cannot work until they can work. But the dog in the tail here surely has to be a central social contract around work. And I thought, as I was on the welfare working group, what is it that's determined our sense of citizenship? We're all boat people. My Maori ancestors were Ngāpuhi. They arrived here 1,000 years ago on our boat. My European ancestor arrived here in 1952. But we've all come here for a purpose, whether it's opportunity for resources, whether it's to escape a restrictive class structure in Europe, whatever. We've come here for a purpose. We're all migrants to New Zealand, and that migration is for a better life. And we've built around ourselves in this sense of importation of ourselves, a sense of citizenship which has been gelded by several things. One is unquestionably the 1938 Social Security Act. It is a defining piece of legislation in terms of the mantra of our country. Another, of course, is in the unique treaty between the colonising people of the 17th and 18th century, the 18th century in particular, and the indigenous New Zealanders, Maori. That's an extraordinary and unique phenomenon, the Ture Ture o Waitangi. If you say to New Zealanders, what does it mean to be a New Zealander? What is our citizenship about? In fact, it's extraordinary how embarrassed we become about even the conversation. It's like talking to doctors about status. They'd much rather talk to you about car parks and lockers than what really matters to them, which is how people perceive them. Status is a thing we're just a little bit uncomfortable about. The same is true of our citizenship. And in fact, I'd suggest to you that a lot of us only realise what it is that we hold dear when we hear someone expose a particularly foreign point of view. And when we heard the opposition to President Obama's universal access to healthcare reforms, and we heard people say, why should I pay taxes to support that person who hasn't taken the opportunity to earn enough money to pay for their own healthcare? We thought, what planet is that point of view from? How alien is that perspective? And you suddenly realise what it is that we hold dear. You suddenly realise what it is that we value. We are a caring and enabling society, and we believe in looking after those who are disadvantaged. But there's some other aspects of our citizenship which place a very high demand on us, and one of those is that we expect, as New Zealanders, universal access to excellent education. In fact, for most of our history, social mobility has been on the back of that education. And as a kid who went to Otahu College, which is Decile 1, as you well know, social mobility in my vintage was unquestionably on the back of education. And I am very fearful in 2011 when I see university entrance attainment rates at Decile 1 schools of 1%. And if you look at Decile 1, 2 and 3 schools, the university attainment rate's 13%. And I say, gee, that taonga, that birthright of universal access to health education, I wonder to what extent that's now in breach. There are some good things though, and I'm hugely encouraged by the Grow Your Own program here, and I'm also hugely encouraged by the health science academies starting at James Cook and Otahu Colleges, two of the local schools. These health science academies are nothing but good news, where kids spend the whole of years 11, 12 and 13 embedded in a health science academy. There's only two subjects that matter in health education. One's English, the other's chemistry. You can teach any idiot biology, you can teach any moron physics, but if you don't have... I'm living proof of both of those. But if you don't have English and you don't have chemistry, you will struggle. And so these schools are embedding the core academic subjects, plus they're doing bridging courses, plus they're doing... And the idea is that when these kids leave year 13, they will be ready to enter any of the conventional health training programs. They will already have the certification and the bridging courses done. And you think about what this means. First of all, they turn up to school because education's purposeful. At some South Auckland schools, 1 kid in 3 is not at school on any particular day. These kids go because education has a purpose. The second thing is we are preparing guided health disciplinary missiles to fire back into the whānau and the communities. What better is a health advocate than some inspired year 11, 12 or 13 student wound up with some health literacy and shot back into their families? This is health advocacy 101. And finally, it has an employment outcome. What better employment can you have than in the growth industry of health? So there are some upsides, but there's this other part of our citizenship. We expect to get the health care we need, when we need it, how we need it, at the point of time that we want it. It's an extraordinary demand on everybody in this room. And in a small, relatively poor country, it is an outstanding demand on us. We have an expectation of health care which sits here. We do not have, in my opinion, the wit or the will to debate that expectation. That expectation is extraordinary upon us, and every one of us in this room simply has to accept that that is the expectation on us and we have to meet it. But it is a profoundly demanding one. And so I begin any conversation like this by saying, core to our citizenship is this expectation of health care, and that expectation is demanding. So be it. The next thing we need to talk about in the context of the expectation is the effect of the ageing of our population on the demand for health services. And the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research forecasts that as over the next decade, from now to say 2021, we'll need somewhere between 40 and 70% more health workers to maintain current health service levels. They're recasting this for us again at the moment, as Jeff can tell you, the National Health Board, and they're still talking about 45% more health workers to 2021. Now, the point here is that not one of the medical disciplines will be at 140% of today's base in 2021. Not one of the medical disciplines will hit the bottom range of expectation of additional health workers. But in fact, there are factors which make the prediction of demand from NZIER profoundly conservative. The first is that the elderly patient or the older patient of 1990, 2000, 2010 and 2020 have almost nothing in common. We have become so effective at managing acute disease, myocardial infarction, strokes, minor infections and so on, that the elderly patient is increasingly living with complex chronic disease. They are a different patient with quite different demands. And to have a linear projection of demand based on more older people overlooks the very fact that medicine, I'm talking about the broader context of health, is the victim of its own success. We have created an incredibly complex population of patients. So be it. But again, this means that a 40 to 75% projection doesn't take that into account. It also doesn't take into account the burgeoning technology for end-of-life care, which is profoundly expensive. And one of the very difficult conversations that we are going to have is about how we shift to patient-directed care around end-of-life care and about advanced care planning. It is something we are going to have to do. It's about restoring dignity to death and autonomy to our patients and to our communities. But, geez, we need to get the conversation right, because we could very easily create an image of Sarah Palin's death squads riding across. If we don't get this conversation right, we could actually put this whole agenda back a long, long way. Most of us in this room would prefer to die at home in dignity on the end of 1,000 tubes in ICU. We have to actually respect that dignity, but it's also one of the things we have to build into just how do we project forward. Now, in my opinion, the argument for advanced care planning is around patient autonomy and choice. It just so happens that financially it's a very, very good idea. There's another demand driver we cannot get our heads around, and that is the health service consumption by the increasingly affluent and increasingly health anxious, well-worried sick. This is a demand for health care which is not linear. This is a demand for health care which is fuelled by medical scientists like me, because we sell this myth. You invest in me, I will translate this into you living forever well. That is the mythology of the scientific period of medicine. For 500 years we've been selling that promise. And we've now created an expectation for people that they'll live forever well, which is probably one of the reasons why the naturopaths and the homeopaths and the chiropractors have such a burgeoning trade, because they're cashing in on this gap between what we can deliver and what the expectation is. My beef with the quacks is that they sell sickness, not wellness. The basic tenet is unless you do this or have this, you will be sick. Unless you take this, you will be sick. It's a fundamental tenet of sickness. And it actually reinforces the very driver of the health service consumption. We as a country are privy to some of the world's most expensive urine. There are other drivers of health service consumption by the well-worried sick. It includes a massive investment by the health disease industry. There's more money spent by the pharmaceutical companies in direct-to-doctor propaganda than the budgets of all the world's medical schools. We are not accidentally stupid. And for every dollar spent on me, there's $10 spent on our consumers. We have people paying 3 times more for bottled water than they do for petrol on the basis that they're worried sick about not drinking 6 litres of water a day. How sophisticated is this marketing? And finally, of course, we have a perversely remunerated health system where we're remunerated to do things, not solve things. We're remunerated to behave in isolationist terms. We're remunerated to behave transactionally. The whole end result of this is we have a medicalised society which interprets its life in medical lexicon, which looks for a magic bullet and actually sees itself as having an expectation for living forever well, which just generates consumption. Now, the problem with the middle classes consuming health care is someone's going to miss out. That's the problem with this health service consumption.